The question came without warning, without preamble, without any of the careful architecture that usually preceded the most consequential moments in a person's life. It arrived simply, plainly, the way a stone drops into still water, and the ripples it made that evening would spread outward for years. "Will you marry me?" The words hung suspended in the air above the white tablecloth, and the half-finished plates and the soft candlelight. 4 words, plainly spoken, with the weight of years behind them. The restaurant had been chosen for its privacy, its high-backed booths, and ambient lighting, designed to shelter important conversations from the curious ears of the world. But in the fraction of a second after Victoria Hayes spoke those 4 words, every other sound in the room seemed to vanish. The soft clink of silverware, the low murmur of other diners, the distant piano threading through the air like smoke. David Carter sat across from her, his large hands resting on the white tablecloth, his expression the face of a man who has just heard something in a language he cannot quite place. Beside him, his 18-year-old daughter Emma had gone perfectly still, her fork suspended halfway between her plate and her lips, her dark eyes moving slowly between the woman who had spoken and the man who had not yet found words to answer. Victoria stood at the head of the small, private table she had reserved, weeks in advance. Her posture impeccable, her composure only fractionally disrupted by the fact that her hands were trembling very slightly at her sides. She had built a business empire from nothing. She had negotiated contracts that made grown men sweat through their suits. She had stood before shareholders and boards of directors and hostile press and held herself like a wall. And yet, standing here now, having said the most honest sentence she had spoken in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten the name of: vulnerable. The silence stretched. And then Emma set down her fork, pushed back her chair, and rose slowly to her feet. David Carter had never expected his life to take this turn. At 45, he had built something modest and solid, a life shaped by routine, responsibility, and the particular quiet dignity of a man who has accepted his circumstances without bitterness. He woke each morning at 5:30, made coffee in the same blue-speckled percolator he had owned for 11 years, and left for work at the warehouse distribution center by 6:15. He managed a team of 14 people with a steadiness that earned him respect without fanfare, the kind of manager who remembered birthdays, who covered shifts when someone's child was sick, who never once took credit for another person's solution to a problem. His supervisor had twice offered him a promotion that would have meant longer hours and a quieter desk, and twice David had politely declined because Emma's school schedule required him to be available by 4 o'clock, and that was simply non-negotiable. He drove a 9-year-old sedan that ran reliably, if not beautifully, a dark blue car with a scratch along the rear passenger door that he had been meaning to address for 3 years and kept not addressing, because there was always something with a more legitimate claim on his Saturday afternoons. He owned a small house in a neighborhood where people knew each other's names and looked out for each other's yards and left surplus tomatoes on each other's porches in August. He kept a vegetable garden in the backyard that he tended on Saturday mornings, working methodically from one end to the other, kneeling in the dirt with a focus that kept the rest of his life at a useful distance. He had found, over the years, that the act of pressing seeds into dark soil and waiting for something green to push through was one of the few things that made the deeper silences in his life feel bearable rather than unbearable. Sandra had died 11 years ago, when Emma was 7. A brain aneurysm, sudden and indiscriminate, the kind of thing that doesn't announce itself. She had been laughing at something on the television when it happened, and David had always held on to that detail, the way a man holds on to the last warm thing in a cooling room. She had been happy in her last moment, and that mattered, even when everything else felt impossible to hold. The years that followed were not easy years, and David had never pretended otherwise to himself, which he believed was the thing that had kept him functional when functionality was far from guaranteed. He had grief, and a 7-year-old, and a mortgage, and his own cracking heart, and in the evenings after Emma was in bed, he would sometimes sit in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee and feel the full weight of everything pressing down on him. And he let himself feel it, because he had read somewhere once that grief denied tends to express itself sideways and unpredictably. And he could not afford sideways. He navigated all of it with the grim, deliberate focus of someone who has decided that falling apart is not an option he can afford. Not because falling apart wasn't tempting, it was. Some nights, enormously tempting, but because there was a 7-year-old in the next room who needed him to be standing when the morning came, Emma became his North Star. Not in the smothering way of parents who cannot locate themselves outside their children, but in the truest sense, she gave him direction when direction was the only thing keeping him upright. He coached her little league team. He sat at the kitchen table every night while she did homework, reading or paying bills or doing nothing much, just being present, because he understood instinctively that presence was the thing she needed most. He attended every recital, every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every science fair and debate tournament and track meet and awards assembly, always arriving a few minutes early and finding a seat where he could see everything, carrying with him the quiet, watchful pride of a man who has decided that presence is the most valuable thing he can offer, and is therefore determined to offer it fully. He had been offered dates over the years. Friends arranged dinners. A woman at his gym had been persistent and kind, and he had liked her well enough to feel genuinely guilty about the gentle wall he kept erecting between intention and action. It was not that he feared love, exactly. It was something more complicated. A sense that bringing another person into the careful ecosystem he and Emma had built required a certainty he could not manufacture on demand, and that forcing it would ultimately hurt everyone involved more than the loneliness ever could. So he remained alone. And if there were evenings when the house felt very quiet after Emma went to bed, he did not dwell on them. He read. He watched whatever game was on. He went to sleep and started again. 6 months before the evening that would change everything, Emma had sat across from him at the same kitchen table, where she had done her homework for a decade, and she had looked at him with the particular directness that was one of the things he loved most about her, and she had said, "Dad, you've spent your whole life taking care of me. It's time you started taking care of yourself too." He had smiled in the way that meant he was not going to engage with the substance of what she'd said, and reached over to steal one of her French fries and changed the subject entirely. Emma had let him, but she had not forgotten. The day David met Victoria Hayes, he was running 20 minutes late for nothing in particular. It was a Thursday afternoon in late October, and he had taken a different route home from the warehouse because the main road was torn up for repaving, and the detour wound him through a part of the city he rarely visited wide. Tree-lined streets with old houses set back from the road and leaves banked in amber drifts along the curbs. He saw the car pulled to the shoulder from a distance, a sleek, dark vehicle, clearly expensive, with its hazard lights blinking. A woman stood beside it, her phone pressed to her ear, her expression conveying the specific frustration of someone who is accustomed to problems being resolved quickly and is currently watching that expectation fail in real time. David pulled over without overthinking it. He had been pulling over for stranded motorists since his father had done the same on a highway outside Cleveland when David was 9 years old, and the lesson had calcified into reflex over the decades. He was not, in any meaningful sense, a man who noticed things like designer coats or the quality of a person's shoes. He noticed that the woman looked cold and stressed, and that the tire was flat, and that she was holding her phone at the particular angle of someone whose signal was unreliable. He introduced himself, confirmed she hadn't been able to reach roadside assistance, and set about opening the trunk to find the spare. It took him about 25 minutes, working in the growing dark of a Thursday afternoon, while Victoria stood to one side making 2 more phone calls that she eventually abandoned, watching this stranger with an expression that moved gradually from impatience to something quieter and harder to name. When he was done, he closed the trunk, wiped his hands on the cloth he kept behind his seat for exactly these occasions, and told her she should get the tire properly looked at before the weekend. She had reached into her bag almost immediately. David registered the gesture and stopped it with a small shake of his head that was not unfriendly, but was completely unambiguous. "It wasn't a problem," he said. "Drive safe." And then he had gotten back into his 9-year-old sedan and driven away. Victoria Hayes stood on the shoulder of that tree-lined street for a moment after his taillights disappeared around the bend, and she felt something she could not immediately identify. It took her until she was back in the car, moving again through the evening traffic, to recognize it. She felt seen in the most ordinary, undemanding way possible, by someone who had required absolutely nothing from her in return. It was not a feeling she was used to, She had built her empire from the ground up, starting with a single logistics company she had acquired at 28, with borrowed capital and ferocious intelligence, expanding it over the following 17 years into a conglomerate that controlled freight, warehousing, and distribution networks across 11 states. Her name opened rooms. Her presence rearranged the energy of meetings. She was profiled in business publications under headlines that used words like formidable and visionary and occasionally ruthless, which she had come to accept as a compliment in the particular dialect of people who believed that a woman exercising the same strategic decisiveness they admired in men required its own distinguishing label. She had learned long ago to wear that reputation like a second skin, to let it precede her into rooms and do the work that reputations do, because the alternative, presenting herself simply as a woman who sometimes felt exhausted and lonely and genuinely uncertain about the directions her life had taken, was not something the world she inhabited had much tolerance for, and tolerance was a currency she could not afford to spend carelessly. The people in her orbit wanted things from her. Her board wanted results. Her advisors wanted access. The men who had pursued her over the years had wanted, at various depths, the proximity to her success that a relationship with her would provide. She had grown skilled at identifying the wanting in people before they recognized it in themselves. David Carter had looked at her and wanted nothing. He had simply fixed the tire and left. She found that she could not stop thinking about it. She found him through the distribution company. He worked for a phone call to a contact who knew a regional logistics director, who knew the regional operations lead, who knew the warehouse manager by name, and she felt only briefly self-conscious about the reach this required, about the fact that she was using the infrastructure of her professional life to locate a man she had met on a roadside, because she could not stop thinking about the way he had simply helped her and walked away. She had done stranger things for less defensible reasons, and she had learned long ago that hesitation was expensive, and she was not in the habit of paying for it unnecessarily. She called him herself. His voice on the phone was the same as it had been on that street. Even, without pretense, mildly surprised, she thanked him properly. And when she asked if he would allow her to take him to dinner, just to express genuine gratitude, he paused long enough that she thought he might decline. And then he said, with the air of a man who has decided that suspicion would be uncharitable, that he supposed that would be all right. The restaurant she chose that first evening was elegant without being theatrical, and David arrived in the nicest thing he owned, a sports coat he had bought for Emma's middle school graduation ceremony, and worn perhaps twice since. He looked, Victoria thought, when she saw him across the room, like a man who was slightly uncomfortable with occasion, but determined not to show it, and she found that endearing in a way she couldn't have predicted. Over dinner, she had expected to make conversation in the efficient, socially polished way she always did, moving through subjects with practiced ease. Instead, she found herself talking, actually talking, not performing about things she rarely put into words. She told him about growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment in a city that had not been kind to her family, about her mother working 2 jobs and still coming up short at the end of every month, about the particular hunger of watching a world through glass and deciding you were going to get to the other side of it no matter what it cost you. David listened in a way that she had almost forgotten people could listen without waiting for his turn to speak. Without angling the conversation back toward himself, without the almost imperceptible forward tilt of someone who is already composing their response while you're still forming your thought. He simply attended to what she was saying with a patient, uncomplicated care that made the words come more easily than they had in years. Partway through, she realized she had said something about her mother, something specific and unguarded, that she had not said aloud to anyone in the better part of a decade, and the realization did not make her want to take it back, which was itself unusual enough to pay attention to. He asked questions that were specific and thoughtful. He did not appear to be cataloging her life story for later use. He was just listening. The dinner lasted 3 hours, which was 2.5 hours longer than she had planned. She had not intended for there to be subsequent dinners, and yet when she found herself, 10 days later, with an afternoon that had unexpectedly cleared, her first thought was not about any of the dozen professional obligations that could have filled it. She called David, who said he had an hour before he needed to be home to start dinner, and they met at a small coffee shop near his neighborhood that he clearly knew well. The person behind the counter greeted him by name and they talked until his hour was up, and he stood and said he had to go. simply and without apology, because his daughter would be home. Victoria sat in the coffee shop for another 10 minutes after he left, drinking cold coffee and understanding that something had begun. The months that followed had the quality of weather-changing season, gradual enough that on any individual day you might not notice the shift, but unmistakable in aggregate. They saw each other with increasing frequency, fitting meetings into the architecture of David's schedule, because his schedule was the less flexible of the two, and that was simply the reality. Victoria, who had never organized her personal life around anyone else's constraints, found the adjustment easier than expected, which told her something. She began to know the rhythms of his days, the early mornings, the careful management of time, the way he always had exactly one beer with dinner and then switched to water, the way he talked about Emma with a matter-of-fact love that was somehow more moving than extravagance would have been. She met Emma once, briefly, at the coffee shop. David introduced them simply as people who knew each other, and Emma had been polite and observant in the way of a young person who is paying close attention to something they're not yet ready to address directly. For David, the experience of these months had an element of strangeness he could not fully parse. He had not gone looking for this. He was not, by any stretch of imagination, the kind of man who appeared in the kind of story where a woman like Victoria Hayes entered the picture. The gap between their lives was not abstract to him, it was concrete and daily, and impossible to ignore. He had looked her up, eventually, the way he might look up anything he needed to understand, and what he found had been genuinely staggering. The scope of what she had built, the number attached to her name in financial publications, the way her face appeared in photographs alongside people who occupied entirely different strata of the world than the one he inhabited. He had sat with that information for a few days and tried to understand what he was doing in a context that contained it, and had arrived at no satisfying conclusion. But he kept showing up, because she was real with him in a way that had nothing to do with any of the numbers, and because the hours he spent talking with her had begun to feel like something he did not want to give up, even as every practical instinct he had told him to be careful. The practical instincts had reason to be cautious. The attention came, as he knew it would, in the quiet, inevitable way of things that have been building just outside the frame of your vision, the way things in Victoria's world were noticed and commented upon and dissected by people who made their living doing exactly that, who had built the machinery of observation and speculation over years and kept it running on the fuel of other people's lives. He had not been naive about this possibility. He had, in fact, been thinking about it since the first dinner at the restaurant, when a woman at a nearby table had looked at them a fraction of a second too long, with the particular quality of recognition that precedes the reaching for a phone. A photographer caught them walking outside a bookshop in November, close together in conversation, unremarkable except for who she was. The image circulated. The commentary followed with the speed and appetite that such things always did. Men in David's position did not typically merit much attention on their own, but the contrast between his life and Victoria's made for a story that was easy to construct and easier to consume. The warehouse manager, the billionaire, the obvious imbalance, the obvious question about motivation. The word opportunist appeared in one piece. The phrase gold digger appeared in 3. David read none of these things himself, but a colleague at the warehouse printed one out and left it on his desk without explanation. And that told him enough. He began to create distance. Not dramatically, not with a confrontation or a speech, but in the quiet, incremental way of someone who has decided that the kindest thing they can do for another person is to remove themselves from the situation before any more damage can be done. He returned Victoria's calls a little more slowly. He found reasons that the timing didn't work. He was genuinely busy, genuinely constrained by the actual business of his actual life, and he used both of those things as cover for something else. The belief, deep and self-protective, that he was doing her a favor. The board of her company had reportedly expressed concerns. Her advisors had reportedly advised. He was, in the accounting of her world, a liability, and the most useful thing he could be to her at this point was absent. Victoria noticed. She noticed with the precision of someone who had spent years reading rooms and situations and the barely visible tells of people who believed they were concealing themselves effectively, the micro shifts in availability, the emails that took a day longer to return, The sense that a warmth which had been present was still technically present, but had been turned several degrees cooler by something she hadn't been given the opportunity to address. She understood what was happening. And she understood why. And for 2 weeks she let it happen. Because she needed those 2 weeks to arrive at a certainty she would not abandon at the first pressure. She had built her entire professional life on the principle that you do not pursue a strategy halfway, that commitment uncertain of itself always costs more in the end than commitment withheld. She applied this principle to the situation at hand and reached a conclusion. Then she drove to his house. It was a Sunday afternoon. She had not called ahead. David opened the door in the clothes of a man who had been working in the garden, a flannel shirt, old jeans with dirt at the knees, and an expression that moved through surprise and something almost like relief before settling into a careful neutrality. She had not prepared a speech, which was deliberate. Speeches allowed the listener to formulate counter-arguments while you were still speaking, and she did not want a debate. She wanted a conversation. He let her in, and they sat in his kitchen, and she told him, with the directness that was the most fundamental thing about her, that she knew what he was doing, and that she was asking him to stop. She said she didn't need him to have money, and she said it without the slightly defensive edge that sometimes crept into people's speech when they were trying to convince someone of something they weren't quite convinced of themselves. She said it flatly, clearly, the way you state a coordinate. She said she didn't need him to be something he wasn't, or to fit into a world that had no particular right to require his presence, that had in fact no metrics by which it could measure the actual value of what he'd built and maintained for the past 11 years. She said that she had spent the better part of 2 decades building things, and accumulating things, and achieving things, and that the specific ache of her life in recent years had not been about any deficiency in what she had built, but about the absence of someone with whom she could simply be, someone who was not in any way measuring her against her own net worth, or calculating what they might gain. Someone who listened to her not because she was useful to listen to, but because he was actually curious about what she thought. She said David Carter was the first person she had met in a very long time who made her feel like the money was beside the point. And that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, an enormous thing, and she was not in the habit of treating enormous things as though they were disposable. She stopped speaking. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the November garden was mostly bare and brown. David sat across the table from her and did not say anything for a long moment. And then he said, "I'm afraid I'm going to hurt you." And she said, "You've already decided to protect me from something I haven't asked to be protected from. That's not the same as not hurting me." He did not have an answer for that. And after a while she stood and said she had to go. And he walked her to the door. And when she reached the threshold, she turned and looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face was enough. "Think about it," she said. And he nodded. And she left. David stood in his doorway for a while after her car had gone long enough that the cold came through his flannel shirt and settled against his shoulders, and then he went back to the garden and picked up the trowel he had abandoned on the walkway and turned it over in his hands without using it. He knelt in the cold dirt and dug with his hands instead, because the trowel was too efficient for what he needed, which was the simple resistance of the ground and the smell of the turned earth and the physical fact of something real beneath him. He thought for a long time about all the things he had told himself over the years about what he was and was not allowed to want, and whether those things were wisdom or whether they were fear wearing the clothes of wisdom, and whether there was a moment, some particular tipping point he had missed, when the protective instinct had become not protection at all, but a kind of quiet refusal dressed up as virtue. Emma came home that evening to find her father quieter than usual. Not distant, not troubled in any way that required intervention, simply quieter, in the mode of a man who is occupied with something interior and has not yet finished occupying himself with it. She made dinner while he set the table pasta, because it was a Tuesday, and pasta was what Tuesday called for in their household, and they ate together as they always did, side by side in the small kitchen with the window over the sink showing the dark yard. And she did not push him, because she had inherited from him the understanding that some things need to arrive at their own pace, and that pushing them only sent them underground. But after they had cleared the plates, and he was standing at the sink, she came and stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders were touching, and said nothing at all, just stood there, solid and present, in the way he had stood beside her for 11 years, when silence was the more honest language. He reached over and put his arm around her, and she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. And he thought, she's going to be all right. Whatever happens, she is going to be all right. And that certainty released something in him that had been locked for a long time. Victoria planned the dinner with the same attention she brought to negotiations that mattered. Which is to say, she thought about every detail without being precious about any of them. She reserved the private dining room of a restaurant she knew to be genuinely good without being performative, a place where the food was the main event and the atmosphere did not try to overwhelm it. She had debated for several days whether to invite Emma and had decided finally that to exclude her would be a kind of dishonesty, that what she intended to do affected Emma as much as it affected David, and that to treat Emma as a secondary consideration at this particular moment would be exactly the wrong signal. So there were 3 chairs at the small table, and 3 place settings, and 3 glasses of water already poured when David and Emma arrived. Emma wore a simple dark blue dress. David wore the same sports coat. Victoria was already seated, and she stood when they came in, and there was a brief, slightly awkward moment of greeting that resolved into the ordinary business of sitting down and looking at menus. The dinner was good. They actually talked with the particular ease of people who have separately decided they are going to show up honestly to whatever the evening required. Emma had a directness her father had given her, and a warmth that was entirely her own. And she asked Victoria questions that were neither deferential nor aggressive, but simply genuine, and Victoria answered them the same way. David watched them across the table with an expression that a person observing from outside might have struggled to name. It was something between wonder and the specific relief of a man who has been bracing for impact and found instead that the ground beneath him was solid. They had moved through the main course and into the kind of unhurried conversation that follows good food when Victoria set down her glass. She did not plan it for this exact moment, or rather, she had planned it loosely. As you plan the general shape of something while accepting that the specific moment will announce itself when it arrives. She knew when it arrived. She rose from her chair slowly, because this deserved a kind of gravity, and the table fell quiet, and she looked at David with the complete, unguarded attention of someone who has decided that the outcome of this moment is worth every risk the moment carries. "David Carter," she said, and her voice did not waver, because she had decided before she rose from that chair that whatever happened next, she would not let it waver. "Will you marry me?" She had not said "I love you" first, or "I need you," or any of the softer constructions that might have made the question smaller and safer. She had said simply the thing she meant, because that was the only way she knew how to mean it. The silence was total. David's face underwent a series of small transformations: surprise, disbelief, something that moved briefly through the territory of joy before doubt pulled it back, and he opened his mouth, but nothing came out immediately, because some questions are large enough that the throat closes around any immediate response. Victoria was aware of Emma in her peripheral vision. She had been steeling herself for this, the possibility that Emma would be the obstacle, that the daughter who had lived at the center of her father's world for 11 years would see this proposal as a threat to that center and respond accordingly. It was a reasonable thing to have worried about. It was not what happened. Emma pushed back her chair and stood up, not quickly, deliberately, with the considered movement of someone who knows that what they are about to say is important and wants to say it correctly. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. She met Emma's eyes and found in them something she had not expected. Not hostility, not warning, but a look of clear, uncomplicated feeling. Emma turned first to her father, who was still sitting very still, and then back to Victoria, and she spoke in the measured, unhurried voice of a young woman who has thought about this more carefully and for longer than anyone in the room has yet understood. "If there is anyone in this world who deserves to be loved again," Emma said, "it's him." Victoria heard the words and felt them land somewhere deep and unexpected. Her throat tightened. She had prepared, in the vague way of someone who knows a moment will be emotional, for some version of emotion, but not this. Not the specific precision of this. From this particular person. Emma was not finished. "I've been praying for years," Emma said, more quietly now, as though the volume of the room had shifted without anyone touching anything, "that my dad wouldn't have to be alone anymore." Victoria felt the tears before she understood they were there. She was not generally a woman who cried in front of other people. She had learned early that vulnerability in public carried a cost, and she had invested years in building the interior architecture that kept her composed in moments that demanded it. But the architecture was not built for this. For the sight of an 18-year-old girl standing in a restaurant dining room and saying with perfect, undefended honesty that she had been carrying a prayer for her father's happiness for years, quietly, without being asked to, because she loved him and she understood his sacrifice, even when he never named it as sacrifice at all. David made a sound. Not a word, just a sound, low and barely controlled. The sound of a man reaching the edge of the composure he has been maintaining by will, and finding that will has limits. He pressed his hand briefly over his mouth and looked at his daughter. And Emma looked back at him. And between them passed something that required no translation. Emma sat back down, but not before she turned once more to Victoria and said, with quiet certainty, "He woke up early every single day, and he went to work, and he came home, and he made dinner, and he helped me with homework, and he never once let me feel the weight of what he was carrying. I know what he gave up. I've always known." She paused. "You should know too." The three of them were quiet for a moment, a silence that was not empty, but full, packed with the weight of things spoken and unspoken, with gratitude and grief, and the particular sweetness of a moment that will be carried forward into all the moments that follow it. Victoria understood, sitting in that room with those two people, that she had underestimated what this evening could be. She had come in thinking about what she needed, what she was asking for, and she had not fully reckoned with the fact that the asking itself would be an act of receiving, that in the space of a few minutes, she would be given something she had not known she needed, which was to be witnessed by someone who had no reason to be generous to her, and chose generosity anyway. David reached across the table, not toward Victoria, not yet, but toward Emma, covering her hand with his in the particular way he had been covering her hand since she was 7 years old, and the world had delivered its first unbearable piece of news. Emma turned her hand over and held his, and neither of them looked away from each other for a long, full moment. Then David looked at Victoria. His eyes were wet. His expression was the most open she had ever seen it all, the carefulness gone, the protective scaffolding set aside. Nothing between her and what he actually felt. He exhaled, slowly. He lifted his free hand from the table and extended it toward her across the white cloth. Palm up. And waited. Victoria reached across and put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm, steady. The hands of someone who had been working hard his whole life, and she felt the solidity of it, the realness, and this time she did not stop the tears from coming, because there was no longer any reason to stop them, and she was tired of having reasons. "Yes," David said, and his voice was quieter than he intended, and steadier than he had any right to expect. "The answer is yes." He had not rehearsed those words. He had not planned them or dressed them up or found a better way to arrange them. They were simply the truest thing in the room, and being true, they were sufficient. He was not a man who had rehearsed those words. They were not the words he would have chosen if he'd had time to prepare, to find something adequate to the occasion. But they were true, and being true, they were enough. In the months that followed, there were things to navigate. There always were, in lives that are being meaningfully reorganized. Victoria's board was informed before the announcement became public, and there were conversations that required patience, and a particular kind of plain speaking that allowed no room for euphemism, conversations in which people said what they actually meant, because she had made it clear, early in her tenure, that she preferred difficult honesty to comfortable circumlocution. Victoria brought the same unbending clarity to those conversations that she brought to any negotiation across the table from someone who did not particularly want to agree with her. She did not ask for approval. She provided information, and she answered questions, and she made it evident, without belaboring the point, that this was a decision she had already made and that the board's energy would be better spent on other matters. David, for his part, navigated the attention with the same undemonstrative steadiness he brought to everything. He did not seek out interviews, did not perform anything for any audience, showed up at Victoria's side when that was appropriate, and returned to his own life when it was not, and the people who looked for something sinister in the arrangement found nothing to sustain the narrative, because there was nothing sinister to find. He was, simply, himself, which turned out to be more than sufficient. Emma went off to college in the fall, 2 weeks before the wedding. And David helped her load her car on a Sunday morning, with the methodical care he brought to everything that mattered. She had chosen a school 3 hours away, close enough to drive for long weekends, far enough to be genuinely her own beginning. She was studying environmental science, which David had suspected was where she was heading since the year she was 12, and spent an entire summer photographing insects in the backyard garden and building a catalog that her biology teacher had described, with barely contained astonishment, as the most organized, independent project he had encountered in 20 years of teaching. She left with a carload of things and a lightness about her that David recognized, but could not have named precisely. She had always been a happy kid, in the resilient, resource-rich way of children whose parents showed up for them. But this was something else, something additional. She was leaving without a weight she had been carrying, and David understood, in a way he had no language for, what that weight had been. The wedding was small. Victoria had no desire for spectacle, and David would have been genuinely pained by it. And so they arranged something that fit them both. 22 people, in a restored farmhouse outside the city, on a Saturday afternoon in late October, exactly 1 year after David had pulled over on a tree-lined street to change a stranger's tire. The ceremony was performed by a judge who was a friend of Victoria's from years back, a small, sharp-eyed woman who had known Victoria since long before anyone had attached impressive numbers to her name, and who therefore had the particular standing of someone who could speak at the occasion without performing it. The ceremony was brief and meant it. No excessive flourishes, no theatrical readings chosen for beauty over relevance, just the words that mattered said clearly in a room full of people who were genuinely glad to be there, and showed it by being quiet and attentive in the way that constitutes, at such moments, the most meaningful possible form of witness. Emma stood beside her father, because he had asked her to. Because she had been beside him for everything that mattered, and this was not the occasion to change that. She had made him a card the night before, handwritten on plain paper in the same rounded script she had used since she was 12 years old. And the card said things that David could not have anticipated and would not have been able to ask for, about what it had meant to grow up beside him, about the specific shape of his love, as she had experienced it from the inside. She had not mentioned sacrifice, because she knew he would not want the word applied to himself. She had simply described, in her precise and careful way, the things she had seen him do over the years, the small things, mostly, the unremarkable daily kindnesses, and the cumulative effect of reading them, listed one after another, was that David had had to sit still in the car for a long moment, looking at the page, breathing deliberately until the sharpness in his chest settled back into something manageable. He had folded the card carefully and put it in his inside breast pocket, and there it remained throughout the ceremony, close to his chest. The evening after the wedding, after the farmhouse had emptied and the last guests had driven home through the autumn dark, the three of them sat at a long wooden table in the kitchen of the farmhouse that Victoria had rented for the weekend. Victoria, David, and Emma, who had stayed for the night, before driving herself back to school in the morning. The kitchen was warm and slightly disorganized with the remnants of celebration, and someone had left a candle burning on the table, and they were eating leftover wedding cake with the informality of people who are done performing for the evening and have arrived at the part of the night that is actually real. Emma had a blanket around her shoulders. David had loosened his tie. Victoria had taken off her shoes. It was Victoria who said it, with the gentle, slightly wondering tone of someone who has been turning a question over for a while and has finally decided to simply ask it. "I still don't fully understand why you stood up for me that night. In the restaurant, you didn't know me. You had every reason to be cautious." Emma considered this in the unhurried way she considered most things, not because she was slow, but because she had her father's instinct for giving important questions the weight they deserved, rather than rushing toward the nearest available answer. The candle on the table moved slightly in some imperceptible draft, throwing its light in slow, soft arcs across their faces. "I didn't know you," Emma said. "That's true." She paused. "But I knew him." She glanced at her father, briefly, the way you glance at something you have looked at so many times that looking becomes almost incidental. It is simply where your eyes go when they are telling the truth. I knew how he'd been. For years, The mornings, the evenings, all of it. He never complained. He never made me feel like I'd cost him anything. She was quiet for a moment. But I watched. I always watched. And I could see it the way something in him was still, when it used to be she searched for the word, louder. Before, she turned back to Victoria. That night, in the restaurant, when you asked him to marry you, it was the first time in years I'd seen him look like that. Like something had turned back on. She shrugged, but it was not a dismissive shrug. It was the shrug of someone offering the truth, in its plainest form. I wasn't going to stand in the way of that. Victoria looked at Emma across the table for a long moment without speaking. Then she looked at David, who was looking at his daughter with an expression that Victoria had come to recognize over the past year, as the specific face he made when something was too large for words, and he had stopped trying to find them. She thought about everything Emma had just described, the years of quiet watching. The burden of knowing your parent is diminished, and not being able to fix it, the particular loneliness of that, and the particular love it required to simply keep showing up anyway, morning after morning, without demanding acknowledgement. She thought about the girl who had been 7 years old when her mother died, and had grown into someone who stood up in a restaurant and said, without hesitation, exactly the right thing, at exactly the right moment, not because she'd been coached or prepared, but because she was the daughter of a man who had shown her every day what showing up looked like. David reached across the table and took Victoria's hand. And then, with his other hand, he covered Emma's where it rested near her plate, so that the three of them were loosely connected in the candlelight of this warm kitchen on the night of the first day of a new arrangement. Outside the farmhouse windows, the October dark was deep and complete. The candle burned on the table. Somewhere in the distance, something small moved through the fallen leaves, and there was a sound like a sigh, or like something settling into the ground. And the evening continued around the three of them as they sat together, a man who had spent 11 years giving everything he had to the people he loved, a woman who had spent the same 11 years building everything except the thing that mattered most, and the daughter who had grown up watching the first of them and had been wise enough, at 18, to make room for the second, and they talked, and they ate cake, and the candle burned lower, and none of them wanted to be the first to say it was time to sleep. It was David who finally said it, as he always had. Because someone had to. He stood, and stretched, and looked at the two of them, these two specific people who were his, and said simply that it had been a good day. Emma agreed that it had, without qualification or elaboration, in the way she agreed with things that she meant completely. Victoria said she thought it might have been one of the best days she could remember in a very long time. And that was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough, not because the words were large, or the sentiment was unusual, but because they were true. And the three people in that kitchen knew them to be true. And truth, said quietly in a warm room, by people who have chosen each other, has a weight and a warmth that nothing else can quite replicate. David stood and turned off the kitchen light, and the room fell into the soft, incomplete dark of a room, still holding the remnant glow of a candle. Victoria leaned forward and blew it out, and for a moment they were all three in the full dark together, not an uncomfortable dark but a settled one, the kind that follows a day that has given you everything it had to give. Emma pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders and said good night in the voice she had when she was about to fall asleep, standing up, warm and slightly blurred at the edges. And the farmhouse was quiet, and the October night held them all in its dark, familiar hands. And what had begun on a roadside a year ago and had grown through uncertainty and public scrutiny and the small, daily courage of ordinary people who had decided to trust each other, all of that had arrived, without fanfare, without spectacle, in a warm kitchen on a October night, at something that three people sitting together could finally, without reservation, call home.